Happy New Year. Hope you've had a good Christmas and festivities and holidays and whatever you have been doing as it is New Year. Time for the traditional New Year's Bob Ross painting, and I'm going to try and time-lapse this one so you can see how I get on, well or miserably. So I've got my, it's not a standard pre-stretched canvas at all. Bob Ross would be horrified, actually he probably wouldn't because he's a nice guy. This is a canvas board, which is not something Bob Ross recommends. He says that the liquid white or magic clear or whatever you happen to be using on it dries too quickly on this. It's what I always use because it's cheaper, and also it's much easier to store several of them. I can stack them because they're flat rather than the canvases that have a thickness to them. So it's what I'm using, it's what I've used for the previous ones. But it's what I'm going to blame if it doesn't go well. So there you go. That's mounted fairly reasonably securely to this tabletop easel. I've got my big acrylic Bob Ross palette. It's not an official Bob Ross palette. Do you know what? That documentary series came out, or documentary single one. Did you see it? The Bob Ross. There are two of them, one about his life and one about what happened after his death. And it's rather sad. I mean, they cut his son Steve out of the Bob Ross company. And yeah, it's all rather sad and corporate horror, really. So I'm not going to endorse using Bob Ross products, unfortunately, even though Bob Ross is great. The company that succeeded him has not been so great. So I'm not endorsing using Bob Ross products, but that also might be a reason why I will fail in this attempt, but we'll see. So this is a palette that I've laser cut this out of a sheet of acrylic, and it still got its protective backing on, which is why it's sort of frosty. That just helps see the colours a little better, but I mean, Bob's is a sort of, is transparent and has a scuffed back. And actually the transparency is probably better holding it up against the canvas so you can see what the colours are actually going to look like. But yeah, artists recommend not using a white palette. So this isn't actually that white, it's kind of off-white grey. We're going with it anyway. And I'm not using Bob Ross thick oil paint. He says to use the Bob Ross brand, obviously, because but not just because they're his brand, but because they're thick oil paints. He says thin oil paints won't work. I'm using cheapy works premium artist oil paints, which probably aren't thick, but they have sat around for a little while, and so they've separated and some of the oils come to the top, and what I've done is use a paper towel to soak the oil off the top and then squeezed out what's left. So hopefully what's left is rather firm because the oil has separated from it. So you know, maybe that does a similar thing, I don't know. And this painting that I'm doing today is going to be based on two Bob Ross videos. You might see if I move this. There's Bob in the background, but I'm not going to, for copyright reasons, I'm not going to run the Bob video alongside my painting. You'll just see what I'm doing, but occasionally if I reference back here, that's what I'm doing, is I'm checking on the video. I think we're on season 23 here, and there are two videos. Falls in the Glen is the main one that I'm going to be looking at. The other one is called, oh, I can't remember, I have to check and I'll put it in the link, but Falls in the Glen is the main one that I'm looking at here, and it's one of those ones that starts with a sky and then you've got density, black density down here. And the reason that I'm doing that is as a bit of a test for the one that I keep saying I'm going to do, my big full background here, which I've painted the black on, but I haven't dared make a start on yet. So this is going to be a test, and maybe this will be the one that finally gives me the courage to get on with that one. So what I've done is I've painted the bottom half with just black acrylic. Bob uses black gesso, I'm just using black acrylic to give this sort of wavy tree line. I don't know if you can see, I have actually pulled up a few spikes to look like trees. You can't really see because what I've done then is I've applied not liquid clear, I am using I'm not using Bramwell's Sweet Pickle. This is a 50-50 mix of linseed oil and odourless paint thinner, which I think is basically what liquid clear, magic clear is. So the bottom half is that with some black and some, I'm using Viridian rather than phthalo green, meh, and a little bit of burnt sienna to dull it down. I've covered the black bit on the bottom with that, and then the top is a mix of, again, the linseed oil and paint thinners with titanium white. And that's why you can see the sort of blurry misty bit in the middle, because I just brought the white down on a little bit onto the background. So that, as Bob would say, is now wet and slick and ready to start painting. I've got my paper towels to hand here, because there's going to be a lot of wiping of stuff, I'm sure, to be done. I've got my jar of tempeh. No, this is odourless paint thinners. I haven't got a brush beater back, and I'm not going to be flicking paint all over my studio, so I'll be using this combined with the paper towels to clean off anything that I need to clean. But hopefully I've got sufficient brushes here that I will be able to not do too much in the way of cleaning mid-painting. I've got one big brush, and again I'm using decorator's brushes that Bob says not to use because they're not stiff enough. I did buy one official Bob Ross brush, and honestly when I was painting with these two I didn't really notice much of a difference, but maybe that's because I'm just not good enough, or I'm not using the rest of the stuff that he says to use anyway. So I'm using standard decorator's brushes. This is a big 2-inch brush that I'm going to use for blending, largely for the sky. In fact, this is a 3-inch, haha, bigger than Bob, 3-inch brush. But the rest of them I'm using 1-inch brushes, and I'm going to be using these oval brushes and some quite small fan brushes and some quite small stipply brushes, because one thing that I want to experiment with in this painting is getting the scale of the foliage down to match the miniatures. So I think I'm going to have to be painting with a smaller head brush. Another thing that I've done, because of what I'm doing this for, painting miniature backgrounds rather than anything else, is that I've actually brought I've turned the canvas the other way from what Bob's doing, because a wider scene is more useful to me than an upright scene. But I'm bringing the horizon line right down. So Bob's painting essentially is like this, but then continues into the foreground, which takes it below where my canvas stops here. I'm stopping in the mid-ground because all of the foreground is going to be the scenery that I'm going to be photographing in front of it. So that's why I'm not going as far forward or as big as Bob will be doing. Right, so I'm going to set the camera onto time-lapse in the hope that we can capture some of this. Who knows what will happen? Stick with me and we'll find out. So here we are, a couple of days later, and this is more or less dry. It's still a little bit tacky in places, but it's more or less dry. And I've just propped it up here so that we can take a proper look, because I'm aware that when I was doing this filming of it, the lighting on it wasn't brilliant. But there you go. This is what it actually looks like. If you had the audio on, or if I had allowed you to have the audio on the video, not cursing and swearing, but not having the most fun time doing some of this. From the very start, I had a paintbrush that had hairs dropping out of it, so that wasn't brilliant. There's some hairs stuck to here that I've not been able to do anything with. I was trying very carefully not to have a green sky by, you know, as Bob said, putting the red on either side of the yellow and then blending it, and trying really hard not to blend across and pick up some of the yellow and drag it back into the blue. But there is a bit of a green tinge in there. I wasn't totally successful with that. I had to play a little bit around with the top of the mountain here. I tried, as Bob says, to really scrape into the canvas, and I found that when I was scraping it was actually taking the paint off. I was getting like white canvas texture over the top, so I ended up going in, you probably saw me going in with a brush afterwards and redefining that top edge. I then thought I should maybe practice my mountain texture, but then I realised that actually it's so far away, and the lights behind it, you can see sort of where the sunset's going down, the lights behind it, so you wouldn't see very much apart from the silhouette. So I scraped all that off and went back to it being just a sort of dark silhouette. Putting in the mist sort of worked okay. I was having issues. I started off using the big fan brush. I've got it somewhere. Started off using the big fan brush to do these trees, and found, I think maybe it was too big a fan brush, or the things were too long. But anyway, it didn't feel stiff enough to be giving these things. So I switched to a smaller fan brush, of which I've only got one, which I was trying to keep for the later stages. So I didn't really want to use it, but I did end up using it. I had to put a lot more paint in it than I thought I did to try and get these trees in the background. But I think it kind of works. I think it's like when it's out of focus, it probably looks alright on the screen. It doesn't look so great from here, but I think when it's slightly out of focus behind some foreground that's the subject matter, I think it won't be too bad. I did lose some of the background trees when I was putting these foreground trees in. I didn't quite have the greens. Bob was using a lot of phthalo green. I didn't have any phthalo green, so I was using a Viridian, and it wasn't quite the colour that I wanted it to be. I think it's okay. And then I was using the fan brush with a very, very dilute paint to do the highlights, because otherwise it just wasn't sticking. So I think maybe there is something in the firmness of the paint that Bob recommends. Maybe I need to get a firmer, better paint of the colours that he uses. I mean, he doesn't use very many colours, so it's probably not a big deal. And you know, the size of tubes that they sell paint in, I'd probably only have to get one to paint all of the Bob Ross pictures that I'm ever going to paint out of it. So it might be worth investing in some thicker, higher quality paints for these, possibly. I realised that I needed a lot more paint. I had to go back and refill my palette a few more times. I thought I'd put loads of paint out, but I actually got through a lot more paint than I thought I was going to get through. I was then playing with these rocks, and I couldn't really get the colours that I wanted with these either. They went a bit green, and then they went a bit too bright here. So I'd quite like to go back into this when this is fully dry. I'd like to go back into it with a bit more of just a light grey, and sort of desaturate these a little bit, put a bit more detail in among the rock structures. And I was actually planning on covering a lot more of the rocks with sort of mossiness, but that didn't work, because trying to put the green paint over the very thick palette knifed paint really didn't work. So you really do need to know where your foliage is going to go before you put the thick palette knife paint in, whatever Bob says about just, you know, sort of making up as you go along and doing what you feel right. You kind of do need to know where you're going to put stuff to avoid putting the thick paint on there in advance. And again, the moss is something that I would like to go back into. It gives a general impression, and again, from a background, it's probably fine. But I would like to go back into it with slightly different coloured green, and with maybe sort of a bit of a finer brush. I did use quite a small brush for this, but it hasn't really picked up any little stipply textures. It's far more sort of just a blob of green now, and I'd like to bring out a bit more detail in it. So I may do that once this is dried fully. I think it will look okay. Does it inspire me to do the big one? Yes. Do I feel prepared to do the other big one? No. I still don't, so maybe I need to do a few more and actually be dedicated to practicing a bit more this year. But as with everything, it's just there are so many things to do that you end up not being able to do lots of the one thing. But I have another canvas, and I would like to do perhaps a snowy mountain to go with the next Kickstarter that I'm going to do. So maybe I will do that to practice a bit more palette knife and try and get this technique better. I think one of the things is I was holding the palette knife partly because I was aware of not blocking the camera, but also because of just the angle that feels natural. I guess I'm used to doing sort of joint filling and things with a plastering knife, so I tend to hold it and scrape down, but actually he holds his palette knife very, very flat to the canvas and drags it down, and that worked a lot better when I was doing these bits here than when I was holding it at quite an angle. So I need to play with that angle and try and make sure that it's pulling off the paint properly, and then I should probably have a go on an actual canvas rather than canvas board and see what difference that makes, see if you know, rubbing like the mountain, rubbing that into the canvas is any easier on an actual canvas. But anyway, not too bad, and it'll be another background option for me to play with, so you'll see this pop up in some photos on the store very soon, hopefully, and on social media, because I'm planning on taking some photos of my forest terrain up against this. That's what it will be there for. So anyway, I hope that was vaguely interesting. Till the next time, God bless, my friends.